So now we're on to mergers and acquisitions. And we're going to find out that mergers, that term is kind of like bonds. Because we'll have a subfamily under bonds where we say bonds, and then we've got notes and we've got bills. So they all fall under the general category of bonds. Well, here we've got the general category of mergers, and then underneath that we're going to have another subcategory, which is unfortunately also called mergers, and then there are going to be some other things, so don't let that freak you out. So what's the basic idea? We're going to start with two or more companies and end up with one. Typically it's just two, sometimes it can be more. So the bidder is the acquiring firm. They're the firm that's going out there and trying to buy another firm. Right now, Tesla, Elon Musk, he is a bidder trying to buy Twitter. That even rhymes, right? So Musk is the bidder there. The target in this situation is the firm that is sought. In our little Elon Musk example, it would be Twitter. And the consideration is the cash or securities offered for the target firm. Now let's talk about, we're going to talk about cash, and typically the securities that we talk about are going to be common stock. Or it may be common stock and something called warrants, which is beyond what we're going to talk about here in this class. But basically, let's just say cash or stock, or it could be a combination of the two. Now, so in this case, Mr. Musk, I think he's offering
43 billion total.
43 billion total, and he did it on a per share basis.
54.20.
Yeah, $54.20, and why does all his stuff end with 420? Because he's a big old weed smoker. That's why. You guys know about 420? Okay, back to the story. Not that I ever did that, but back to the story. Okay, so the consideration is what the target is going, or the bidder is going to have to give to the shareholders of the target company. So next let's talk about the term takeover. And the takeover is a general and precise term. And all it really means is the transferring of control of the company from one group of shareholders to another. So we can talk about Elon Musk doing a takeover of Twitter, and he would be the new shareholder in charge. The control would pass from the current shareholders to him. We can also talk about that in terms of these mergers where one company buys the shares of another company and then takes over control of that firm. So that's also a takeover. And I've drawn out this neat little tree here to kind of give you an idea of how these things break down. So takeovers can occur in one of three ways. First of all, acquisitions, which are what we've already been talking about. That's where you go out and acquire another firm. And then we're also going to talk about proxy contests. Do you remember what a proxy is from chapter 5? No, chapter 6.
When someone votes in your place.
Yeah, when you give someone the right to vote your shares. And we're going to see that that's actually a neat, cheap way to take over control of a company. And then finally, going private. Going private means that someone buys up all the shares, or at least enough, that they can force the company to delist from the stock exchange and go private. In other words, they're no longer a publicly traded company. Now, among acquisitions, it breaks down into three more categories, maybe four, depending on how you count. The first category is merger/consolidation, and we'll talk about those here in a little bit. Then there is acquisition of stock and acquisition of assets. Now, I'm going to talk about all of these things in detail, but I wanted to give you this little tree here so you'd understand how they relate to each other. So let's talk about merger and consolidation. Merger is complete absorption of one company by another, and in the end, only one firm survives. Example, from my own life, my firm, Halliburton, bought another company, Dresser, and when it was all said and done, there was one company headquarters, and that one company headquarters had one name on the building, and it was Halliburton. Dresser ceased to exist as an entity. And so that is an example of a merger. Now, contrast that with the idea of the consolidation, where two firms go together to form an entirely new firm. And so my example here is going to be Daimler Chrysler. And I know this example is getting old, but it's a classic. Daimler. What is their big brand, by the way? They're both car makers. What's their big brand? No.
Oh.
Daimler was a German company, is a German company. No. I'll give you a hint. Hitler drove one. No, Hitler designed the bug. By the way, if you don't know that, VW was started by a, what's it called, a megalomaniac murderer. They're so cute, right? Okay, back to the story. Mercedes! Now, is Mercedes considered a good car? Is Mercedes considered a great car? Oh, yeah. Reliable, luxurious, expensive, right? Okay. Now, let's talk about Chrysler. By the way, let me make sure I'm not going to infuriate too many people. Raise your hand if you drive a Chrysler product. Oh, thank goodness. Okay. Chrysler, do they make great cars? No. Man, I bought my wife a Plymouth Neon back in 1997. Oh, yeah, she's laughing because she knows. Thing got to 50,000 miles and it was leaking every fluid known to man. And I'm a mechanical engineer and even I can't recognize some of these fluids. I'm like, what the hell is that? Piece of crap. Total piece of crap. My folks had a Chrysler. They came to visit me in Dallas, Texas. They had to drive all the way from Dallas, Texas back to Missouri in second gear. And you talk about people behind them honking them and flipping them off. Absolutely, that happened. So now, Chryslers are pieces of junk. So, back to the story. Daimler and Chrysler say, oh, we're going to do a consolidation. You may also hear this called a merger of equals. But I'm going to tell you, we know with certainty it was not a merger of equals for a couple of reasons. It was Daimler Chrysler. Is that alphabetical? Not even in the German alphabet is that alphabetical, right? And then another thing, the entire leadership structure of Chrysler swapped out Americans in those executive roles for Germans. Does it sound like a merger of equals? No, by the way, if you enjoy the Chrysler 300, you can thank Mercedes because it was an old E-Class that they're like, hey, you guys can have that, right? Then they put some, glitzy bodywork on it to make it look more street. Back to the story. Okay, now let me tell you, and there's one more piece of evidence that this was not what it was cracked up to be. Have you ever had food poisoning? Mr. Baum, you've had food poisoning? And let's talk about this end of it, right? When you throw up and you have food poisoning, can you tell what made you sick? Just by looking. What is it? And you don't have to tell me the food, but it's the stuff that didn't digest, right? Yeah, it's this, and you're like, damn, that looks like it did when I ate it. Because your body has rejected it. Does that make sense? By the way, don't ever eat at a vegetarian restaurant, a Hare Krishna restaurant in Prague. It was a weird experience, and it was great, but I was up all night. Back to the story. So, the stuff that you didn't digest is what made you sick. I forget how many years these two kids stayed together, but eventually, Daimler throws up Chrysler, and it looks almost exactly as it did the day they ate it. Did they digest the firm? No. Was it a good merger? No. I thought it was stupid from the get-go. Okay. Questions? That whole merger consolidation thing, typically, we're going to call both of those mergers. And this is the last that you'll hear me speak of consolidation for the rest of our Chapter 21 lectures. So let's talk about advantages and disadvantages of mergers. They are legally simple. What do we mean by that? They don't require the transfer of the title of the assets. And so let's ask a question here. What is a title? What's a title? Yeah, it's a certificate of ownership. And so if, let's say, one rental car company was buying another rental car company, each of those cars would have a title, and each of those titles would have to get swapped over to the bidding firm. In other words, it would be a nightmare. By the way, how many of you have ever actually gone and tried to get a title on a car down at the DMV? Was that a pleasant experience? No. I don't know where these people come from at the DMV, but they're people that I don't see anywhere else. And they like to sit next to me and cough and scratch. But there I am at the DMV, and it's hugely, hugely painful. And I'm only doing one car. Imagine what it's like to do 2,000. Would you like to avoid that? Absolutely you would. And so that's why the merger is so great. You don't have to go through and retitle all of those individual assets. And therefore, it's got a lower cost. Now, here's the disadvantages. It's got to be approved by a vote of the shareholders of each firm. And of course, the acquiring or the bidding firm, typically not much trouble there, but the shareholders of the target firm, typically they've got what's called a supermajority provision, which says that you've got to have greater than or equal to 2/3 or greater than or equal to 3/4 of the shareholders to vote, or the shares, to vote to approve. By the way, the last presidential election where I saw the highest percentage I've ever seen in my lifetime was when Ronald Reagan beat Walter Mondale in 1984. He only got 60% of the vote. How hard do you think it is to get 66.666667% of the shares to vote for anything? It's difficult. It's difficult. And so this is setting a pretty high bar. And obtaining the votes might not be easy because target managers are likely to resist. Now, every time I say target managers, you guys are thinking about the store across town with the big, no, different. So we're talking about the managers of the target firm. Now the question is, why would they be likely to resist a takeover?
They're probably get fired.
Yeah, they're probably going to lose their jobs. And as a result, what are they going to do? They're going to make up all sorts of stories about how, we think we can maximize shareholder wealth more as an individual company, and you just got to wait for our plans to be realized, and there's all sorts of hogwash that these people will put out. Unfortunately, some of the shareholders will buy into that. Okay, so we know they're likely to resist. So what happens when they resist? Well, that is when the bidding company starts trying to acquire stock. If we can't get them to just go along with this thing, we are going to buy the stock so we've got the votes to push this thing through. And so we're going to go out there and we're going to purchase the target's voting stock, and we're going to offer cash, shares, or other securities. And so in other words, we've already mentioned cash and shares, and the securities are on this course. But how does this happen? Well, the bidder makes a tender offer. And we're not talking like dinner in a movie kind of tender here. We're talking about where they tender cash or securities in order to get the stocks. In fact, Elon Musk the other day tweeted, did you see it?
Which one?
Love me tender.
Yeah.
Right? Because he's making a tender for the stock of Twitter. It was a really corny, lazy joke, but it fits here. Okay, now the tender offer. Let's talk about how this whole process works. We start out back with we reach out to the management of the target firm, and we say, we start with the CEO. Dear Mary, we love what you've been doing with your firm. You have to be the most enlightened CEO ever. You've done magnificent, magnificent, magnificent things, and as a result, you have drawn the attention of our esteemed company, as we seek to expand into new markets. Therefore, we would love to sit down and talk to you about the possibility of putting our two great firms together. What does Mary do with the letter? Trash! Why does Mary do it with the letter? Do that with the letter? Mr. Strotman?
Getting fired.
Yeah, Mary's like, oh crap, I got a target on my back. Okay, so the next step, and I say I expect to hear from you within the next week. I don't hear anything from Mary, so what do I do next? I reach out to the board of directors, and I send them all a letter. Recently, I reached out to your CEO, Mary, with an offer to discuss terms for the joining of our two greatly esteemed companies. And now, as I have not heard, unfortunately, I have not heard from Mary, so I'm taking this directly to you, the directors of the firm. By the way, the board of directors, who do they represent? The shareholders. In order for me to buy another company, I have to offer more than the current value of the shares on the market, right? Target shareholders should be thrilled to get this offer because it means they're going to get basically more than their shares are worth. Now, the board of directors representing shareholders, what should they be doing? They should be saying, oh yeah, don't worry about Mary. She's always been a little flaky. Come on over. Let's have dinner and talk about this potential merger. But instead, what do you think they do? By the way, 12 directors on this board, 12 directors on this board. Do you think the new board needs 24 directors? No, maybe we're going to take on 4 of those directors and have a board of 16. What does that mean is going to happen to the other 8 directors? Right? By the way, is being director a sweet gig? Yeah. Now, Elon is talking about making the Twitter directors unpaid, which is kind of nutty. But typically, these people are making good money to do this. They meet what, 4 times a year? Maybe 12 times a year. Sometimes it's via telephone. Other times, do you think they go to Newark to meet? No, they're going, by the way, anyone from Newark? Oh, very good. Okay, Newark is an armpit. Back to the story. I'm sure there are great people there, but Newark, back to the story. You can see the Statue of Liberty from there, so I will say that for it. Back to the story. Hilton Head. Why do we go to Hilton Head? Relax, because after the meeting we can all play golf, right? By the way, if you want to be a scumbag corporate type, and of course that means just a corporate type because we're all scumbags, right? You're going to have to learn how to play golf. Mr. Rich, you look like a born golfer. You've got CEO stamped all over you. Okay, back to the story. It's a great life. And by the way, do they make you fly economy class to get to the meeting? No, we're talking first class if you're unfortunate. If you're fortunate, maybe they send the company plane for you. Wouldn't that be great? So this being a director is a sweet thing. And so as a result, the directors are going to be inclined to say, no, we really stand behind Mary because we think she's got a great plan and other stuff like that. Okay, now when that falls through, that's when we make the tender offer. That's when we go directly to the shareholders and make them an offer for the shares that they hold in the target firm. Now, how do we get, oh, by the way, we make that contingent on getting a certain number of shares. By the way, we know we've got to have probably greater than or equal to 2/3 of the shares in order to get approval for the merger. We know if we want to not pay any taxes on the dividends paid by the target, that we have to get at least 80%. And so what I'm going to say is, a contingent on getting 80% of the shares, I am offering $20 per share. And if only 76% of the shares get ponied up at $20, what do I do?
You drop the price and all.
Drop the price? You need to raise the price because trying to entice some more people into this deal, right? And so now I come back with 22. And at some point, I play this game until I say, this is my best and final offer, which for Elon was his first offer, right? That's what he said, it's my best and final. Okay, now, back to the story. How do they reach out to people? First of all, public announcements. It'll show up in the Wall Street Journal, PR Newswire, all those sorts of things. This is how you reach these shareholders. But a lot of shareholders don't pay attention to those sorts of things. And so the other thing you can do is you can reach out to them through brokerage houses. For instance, Charles Schwab knows that I own 10 shares of GE. If someone was interested in buying GE, they would let Charles Schwab know, and then Charles Schwab would tell all of their GE shareholders, hey, by the way, guys, these people are making a tender offer for your shares. Does that make sense? Why can't I get just a mailing list for the shareholders and just send them all individual love letters asking for their shares? Why can't I do that? Who's got the list? Mary! Mary's got the list. Do you think Mary's going to say, oh yeah, here you go. Would you like that as a PDF or as a spreadsheet? No, that's not going to happen. Mary's going to give you one of these, right? And so that's why you have to reach out through these public ways and avoid having to go through the target. Does that make sense? Okay, so this is where we're going to call it quits for today. Please read the hubris hypothesis before next time. We will be discussing it in class. So, last time we were talking about the acquisition of stock. And why did we have to go out and acquire the stock? Does anyone remember? Why couldn't we just do a straight up merger? Who's giving us grief? Yeah, we started with the CEO of the target firm who threw our letter in the trash. And then we ended up going to the board of directors, and what did they do? Threw our letters in the trash, and the reason they do this is because people are all rationally self-interested and they don't want to lose their sweet gigs. Okay, so then what we have to do is reach out to the shareholders and ask them to tender their shares. And in order to get them to tender their shares, we have to offer them a premium. It's called the merger premium. Now, the reason I have to do that is, let's say for example, Ms. Rafael, what did you pay for your calculator? Let's just say 30 bucks. How about that?
Yeah,
She paid 30 bucks for that calculator. If I just walk up to her now and say, hey, I'll give you 30 bucks for that calculator, what's she going to say? No. And so I have to give her something more than in order to get her to pony up the calculator. And so by definition, you've got to basically pay more than the current market value of the target in order to get it. Now, here's what's funny. The CEO, after it all comes out, this tender offer, here's what the CEO always stands up and says. Oh, this offer vastly undervalues our firm. Knowing what you know, is that statement true? No, it's total bullshit. You can tell the true value of the firm by looking at the share price. They're offering you more than the share price. Therefore, they are offering you more than the firm is worth. Sadly, not many people are smart enough, well, some people are not smart enough to realize that they're having the wool pulled over their eyes. And so this may actually convince some of the target shareholders that they need to pony up, or that they need to hold on to their shares when they would be better off to go ahead and sell them and to the bidder. Okay, so can you trust what CEOs say on television? No. Can you trust what they say in business meetings? No. Can you trust what they say at the financial analyst conference calls? A little more, because if they lie in those, then the SEC may get after them, right? Does that make sense? And so when it gets to getting close to the government stuff, then you can trust a little bit more of what they're saying, but of course the answer is still no, right? You can't trust them. Okay, so what are the advantages of this acquisition of stock? If I go out there and buy 80% of the stock for another firm, do I even have to have a shareholder meeting in order to push this merger through? No, it could just be me alone in a bathroom stall at the Newark International Airport. I could hold a meeting right there because I've got all the shares. Does that make sense? I got the votes. So I don't have to have a shareholder meeting. It also bypasses the target management and the board to appeal directly to the shareholders, because the shareholders, if they're bright, will realize that they stand to benefit. Now, let's talk about why a rational reason the shareholders might hold back. What if they think someone else is going to jump in with another offer? Let's say that the calculator is currently trading for $30. I jump here and offer $45. Mr. Fell might hold off and wait just a little bit and wait for Mr. Rich to say, oh, wait a minute, I'll give you 50. That's the only rational reason, right? And then I guess there's one more. My dad had some stock that was, the company got taken over and he was basically forced to sell his stock. He was not pleased. I'm like, Dad, they offered you a crazy, crazy premium over the current stock price. And he wouldn't ever come around to it and saying it, but here's what he was upset about. He had to pay a capital gains tax. And I said, well, that's, hey, if you've got to pay tax, it means you're making money. And then I realized he was planning to hold on to that stock until he died, right? And one of the reasons my dad wants to do this is because then you get the death option on your taxes, meaning that when it passes on to my sister and me, it will be at the value on the day that he died. So we won't have to pay capital gains tax when we sell the stock. And so my dad, very intent on keeping money out of the government's hands, would rather sit on a stock and die than have it bought out from under him for a premium. Everybody's got different utility functions. Everybody thinks differently, and that's fine. Okay, back to the story. Now, the disadvantages, I love this. The book says it can be unfriendly. Folks, this is called a hostile takeover. Write that down. This is called a hostile takeover. Why is it hostile? CEO's not going along with it. Board's not going along with it. So, of course, it's a battle between the bidding firm and the target firm management at that point. And the target firm's management may resist, and that may actually take the cost higher. And let me explain how that works. When if I make an offer up front and I'm making it to the board and the CEO, and they'll say, well, that undervalues the firm or whatever. Now, if they make that statement out loud to the shareholders, I'm going to have to perhaps pony up even more. And usually what we see is 1 or 2 raises of what people are willing to pay. And so what you want to do is start out, you don't want to go with your last and final offer, which is what Elon says he did. You'll want to creep into this thing. If I'm willing to pay $25 a share for this firm that's currently trading at 15, let's start at 21. And then I'll take it to 23, and then I'll take it to 24, and then I'll tell them, no, that's it, right? And so that's your negotiation tactic. Now, there's also a problem with a significant minority of the target shareholders holding out. What do we mean by holding out? They're not willing to tender their shares. And so you might end up with less than 80% of the firm. And you're saying, wait a minute, I only need, 50% plus 1 to control the firm, greater than or equal to 2/3 to merge with the firm. But that 80% is the magic number for not having to pay taxes on dividends you receive from the target firm as the bidder. And so might be a big deal. And then finally, the last disadvantage is a complete absorption requires a merger. So you've actually got to go back to what we started talking about and make that all formal. And so you end up having to go through all that and putting up with the expense of all that. By the way, do you think mergers are cheap? No. You've got investment banks involved. You've got lawyers involved. Ms. Gass, are lawyers cheap? No. You've got accountants involved. Do we have any accountants here? Accountants aren't cheap. They're not as expensive as lawyers, but they're still not cheap. Anyway, long story short, you got a lot of what we call transactions costs that go along with these mergers. And so it's going to drive the cost up. Questions? So let's assume that I can't get 50, or I can't get greater than or equal to 2/3 of the shares. So I can't get greater than or equal to 2/3 of the vote to do the merger. What I can do then is just offer to buy the assets of the firm. I can offer to buy those individual assets, and all that I need approval-wise from the target shareholders is 50% plus 1, which is easier to do, get greater than or equal to 2/3 or 50% plus 1. The second one's got to be easier, right? Okay, and so that would be a way of actually getting the firm's assets and their business without actually buying the firm itself. So let's talk about how that would look. Let's use the rental car example. If I am Hertz and I'm interested in buying Avis, I think both of those companies are still around. Hertz recently went through a bankruptcy. But if I am Hertz and I'm looking to buy out Avis, instead of buying Avis, what I could do is make an offer for all of Avis's assets and offer that kind of money. If it goes through, I could then take those assets. Avis is still a standalone company. They still have a ticker, they still trade, but now instead of plant, property, and equipment type assets, they're sitting on a humongous pile of cash. So what should happen next in this case? Well, Avis should pay what we call a liquidating dividend, because after all, who does that money belong to? Is it the CEOs? No, it's the shareholders' money. So they should pay a liquidating dividend, and in their last final act, what they should do is find some company that wants to list on the exchange who doesn't currently have a listing, and do what we call a reverse merger, because at this point Avis is what we call a shell company, right? They've still got a ticker that's out there trading, but they don't have any real assets, and so they could actually do this merger. And this is the way that a lot of Chinese companies have listed on US exchanges. And one of the reasons people like to do this is because the reporting requirements are far less stringent than if you're going to do an IPO, plus the cost is lower. But here's the question. What kind of companies do you think are drawn to this sort of reverse merger if one of the benefits is you don't have to disclose as much? Do you think really solid, honest companies are drawn to this? Absolutely not. And so it turns out that a lot of the companies that came to market this way were shady companies with bad accounting practices. And so the SEC is actually cracking down on that now. So your ticker symbol for your shell company isn't worth as much as it used to be. I'm sorry to tell you. Okay, now, so far it sounds pretty easy. We've managed to bypass the shareholders, or we've managed to bypass everybody except for the shareholders. We only have to have 50% plus 1. And so our problem with the minority shareholders holding out is not there. I just need a simple majority. But let's talk about the disadvantages. Remember, we said that with a merger, you don't have to retitle all of the assets. And what was the title? What did we say a title was?
Proof of ownership.
Yeah, it's proof of ownership. And we said that if you do a merger, you don't have to go down and retitle all those. So if we, Hertz, could merge with Avis, we wouldn't have to retitle all of those rental cars. But if we go this way, we have to retitle each and every single last asset of Avis. Now, think about how many rental cars Avis has. And think about spending that much time down at the DMV, right? Do you think it would actually, I think we would actually have to hire an army of people to go to different DMVs to take care of this sort of stuff. Plus, of course, you got to have a lawyer in charge of that whole thing. Ms. Gass, are lawyers cheap? No. Okay. So that's your nightmare example for having to retitle all these assets. Now let's talk about another advantage. If I just buy the assets, do I also get the employees? When I buy that, what is this? Let's say Buick Enclave, crappy little SUV. When I buy that from Avis, does it come with an employee? No. And so who's responsible for taking care of the disposing of the employees. I know that sounds terrible, but of sending them to find their happiness elsewhere. It's Avis, right? They're still their employees. They're responsible for sending these people on their way. If you do a merger, who's responsible for sending the extra employees on their way? Yeah, this is how I ended up laying off 79 people on my 28th birthday. Because, oh yeah, it was a worse day for them than me, I have to admit. It sucks, right? And so you can push off this having to deal with the employees onto the target if you just buy the assets. So sometimes that's worth consideration. Now, does that mean we don't necessarily want these people? No. The day that I was laying off 79 people, I had a list. And they were the list of people that I was told we wanted to come to work with us. Now, why didn't we just offer them jobs straight up and transfer them? Well, they had a union, and they were the only factory in our whole universe that had a union. We didn't want the union, right? So we said, okay, as they would come by, the HR guy had the list, and he would elbow me if I was to tell them that we wanted them to apply at our Carrollton, Texas facility. And it was just like a drive up the road. And so he'd go, boop. I'd say, thank you for your service, and I'd like to encourage you to apply at our Carrollton Road, or Beltline Road facility. Right? Hand him the check. Next guy comes up, obviously high. And the HR man does not elbow me. And I say, have a great life. And he just moves on, right? And so you still can hire these people even if you're not going to take all the employees. Now, let's think about this. You have 4 people at your counter at Hertz. Avis has 4 people at their counter. Now, do you think these people see each other every day? Yeah. Do you think they know who's a slob and who's not? Yeah. Do you think they know who shows up late and who doesn't? Absolutely. So what do? You ask your employees at the Cleveland airport to tell you, hey, which of the Avis people are worth a hoot? And they'll tell you, right? And so then what can you do? You can offer them jobs. But do you have to do anything with the other people? No, Avis has to take care of that. Does that make sense? Folks, people are going to be the biggest challenge you face in managing. It's not going to be technical stuff. It's not necessarily going to be financial stuff. It's going to be dealing with people. And the less dealing with people that you can get by with, the better off you are as far as having to supervise, hire, fire, and all that sort of stuff. That's why those kiosks are becoming very popular at McDonald's, right? Have you ever had one of those kiosks spit in your food? No. Have you ever had a human spit in your food? Yeah, probably, right? And some of them you're going to say, oh no, like you just don't know. Right? Okay, questions? So let's talk about some different acquisition classifications. If you've got 2 firms that are doing the same thing and one wants to buy another, then we end up with what's called a horizontal acquisition because the target and the bidder are in the same business. Now, my example here is old. Let's come up with some new ones. How about T-Mobile? Who did T-Mobile relatively recently buy? Sprint. T-Mobile and Sprint. Now, that's a horizontal acquisition. They are in exactly the same business. Now, you got to be a little careful there, though, because what might the government say about it?
Antitrust.
Yeah, it might bring up antitrust concerns, and we'll get to how we handle those in a little bit. Then we have vertical acquisitions, and I actually sent you an article, of course I'm sure you all read it, about Apple. Apple is getting into, I forget what they're getting into, but, oh no, it was chips. They used to buy all their chips from like Intel, and I'm not talking like tortilla chips, I'm talking silicon chips, right? Okay, so they're getting all their chips from Intel, and that means that basically they have to depend on Intel. Do you really want to have to depend on someone else? No, I would rather control the inputs to my process. And so now Apple's designing their own chips, and they're eventually, I think, going to get to the point where they're making their own chips. Now, as a result of this desire, they went out and bought an actual chip design company. And so that is a vertical integration. Anything where the target and the bidder are in the same, what we would call value chain, then that is a vertical acquisition. For example, if you were an oil refiner and that's all you do, you're having to go out there and buy oil on the open market. If oil prices shoot up dramatically, what does that do to your costs? Your costs go up dramatically, right? What if, though, instead we went out and bought a bunch of oil wells? And now we have basically a guaranteed supply, and the big price fluxes are not going to be as big an issue for us. Does that make sense? What is paper made out of? Trees. So you might see a paper mill go out and buy a forestry company. And in fact, we see that. And then, so where does the paper end up? Office supply stores. Maybe you see a paper mill company buy Office Depot or Office Max or whatever's still available these days. I think Staples is still around, right? And so that's entirely possible that they would do that. In fact, the guy that really came up with vertical integration was a guy named Rockefeller. Have you guys heard of him? He basically, all the way from getting the oil out of the ground and pumping the gasoline into your tank, had that whole operation vertically integrated. And it leads to a lot of cost savings and therefore higher profits for the company that does it properly. So far, reason number one and reason number two can make sense. I can give you good arguments for doing both of those. One that I cannot give you a good argument for doing is number three, and that's called a conglomerate acquisition. And that's where the bidder and the target are in different lines of business. The bidder and the target are in different lines of business. So let's roll back a little while here, and I'll ask this question, and I know what the answer will be, but it's not correct. But here we go. What was Sara Lee's original product? Say again? Bread. And that's always what people say, and it's wrong. Let's talk about come over here. Let's talk about what Sara Lee started out. If you roll back to World War II, I know it's before your time, you roll back to World War II, something strange happens. We send all the men off to fight. What do the women end up doing? They went into the workforce. And you know what? Some of them kind of liked it, right? And so after the war, now the husband's back home, soon to be dad because it's the baby boom, right? Mom still wants to work. Now, who's still responsible for all the cooking, cleaning, and everything else at the house? Mom, because men are pigs. Back to the story. So what does mom do? Mom feels bad because she's not able to make apple pies for her family anymore. Sara Lee says, don't worry about it. Just stop by the store on the way home, pick up one of our frozen apple pies. By the way, it probably tastes better than what you were going to put together anyway. And it did, right? And so Sara Lee takes off and becomes very big in pies. But it turns out the frozen pie market only goes so far. They want to keep growing, so what do? Well, they look for what's called a related acquisition. A related acquisition is where you're buying something that's sort of in the same business, but not exactly. So it's not a true horizontal acquisition. So related acquisition, they go out and they buy a bread business. Now, who are the customers for both the pie and the bread? It's the grocery stores, right? And so the customer base is the same, but there are some little differences here and there. Number one, how long do you think one of those frozen pies can last in inventory? A while. How long does a loaf of bread last in inventory?
2 weeks.
2 weeks. Now, here's what's going to blow your mind. If that's only in America. If you go to China and you get a loaf of bread, Mr. Wong, how many days is a loaf of bread good for in China? Do you know what I mean by bread? Like you make a sandwich? Bread? No? Okay. Okay, so bread in China is good for like 3 or 4 days before it starts to mold. Does anyone know what the difference is?
Preservatives.
Preservatives. When an American dies, you can't really tell how long they've been dead because we are so chock full of preservatives. No kidding. Okay, now back to the story. Huge differences in inventory. And maybe, so that means that Sara Lee, the frozen pies, we could make a delivery every week. Could we get by with delivering bread weekly? Probably not. We probably need to do it more frequently, right, to keep fresh bread on the shelves. Okay, so there are some similarities, but there are some differences, but that's a related acquisition. So far, I'm not truly upset at Sara Lee. And so then what does Sara Lee do next? Well, they decide they still want to grow, but the bread market and the frozen pie market seem to be saturated. So what do? Well, they have a brainstorming session, and I can assume that it's marketing people. I'm going to pick on marketing people here. It's marketing people, and they're brainstorming, because marketing people love to talk about brain. Do you guys like, you get the big flip chart out or the whiteboard, and you write stuff down. You're like, oh, that's a great idea. Okay, so they're having the big meeting, and Ms. Flowers, they're like, now, we've got this dessert business, we've got this bread business, what else could we do? And Ms. Flowers says, you know what goes great with pie? Coffee! Do you like coffee, Ms. Flowers? She does. Okay, so what do? They're like, yeah, that's a great idea. Now, the customer's the same, right? It's the grocery stores. And so they've already got this pre-made set of customers. And so they go out and they buy a company called Dewey Egbert, which is like a European coffee company. And that's their next thing. Now, so far, I'm not too upset with them. This is all related acquisition. But the thing they do next drives me nuts. And that is, they go out and buy Hanes. What does Hanes make? Underwear! Now, before someone makes a joke about there being synergies here because of edible underwear, no, Hanes does not make that. And there's always usually one 15-year-old boy in the room that's going to say that. Hanes does not make that kind of underwear, and neither does Sara Lee interested in that. Now, let's ask this question. If you've grown up in the frozen pie business, what do you know about the underwear business? Not a whole lot. You know that if you eat too much of the pie, you're going to need new underwear because you're going to outgrow your old underwear. That's what you know, right? And so now, suddenly, you've got a whole different market. You've got, by the way, underwear, typically buy it at the grocery store? No, we got to look at a whole bunch of different retailers now, right? And then, let's see, what else is there different about this? Do you think they have different suppliers? Oh, yeah. I never knew about elastic until I got assigned to the underwear division, right? This is the problem with conglomerate acquisition. It puts people in charge of operations that they have absolutely no idea how to run. Does that make sense? And we actually went through this phase back in the 60s and 70s when the same geniuses that brought us the Vietnam War strategy told us that you don't really have to know anything about a business in order to be able to run it correctly. And they were going to use these scientific methods, the same ones they used to win the war in Vietnam. By the way, we didn't win that war. The point here is that they thought, it was kind of an arrogance, which we'll talk about hubris and the hubris hypothesis. There was this hubris that any good manager can run any business, and it's just not true. You have to actually know some things. Does that make sense? Okay, so you'll hear managers talk up conglomerate acquisitions. And what they say may make sense to you listening to it because you already know about the diversification of a portfolio. What does diversifying a portfolio do to the risk of the returns on that portfolio?
Lowers it.
Yeah, it lowers them, right? And so what these folks will say is, oh yeah, we're diversifying the business to make it safer for you, Ms. Rafael, our investor. Remember I told you about the acquisition, the transactions cost to do a merger? They're high, right? We've got to get lawyers involved, we've got to get accountants involved, we've got to get investment banks involved. And so they're paying millions and millions of dollars to be able to do this thing. But you know what? Even in my portfolio, if I've been holding 100% Sara Lee stock, what could I do? I could sell some of that Sara Lee stock and I could buy Hanes stock and achieve precisely the same thing, only with a lower transactions cost. And so don't ever let a CEO convince you that they're doing you a favor by diversifying their business. They're not. Your transactions costs are far lower than theirs. Does that make sense? The only time a conglomerate acquisition makes sense is if the business is family owned. Because this might be the only way these people have to diversify their portfolio because they are 100% invested in this family firm, and it might make sense for them. But for anything that you're involved with, and I'm assuming none of you are wealthy heirs of huge family corporations, anything you're involved with, you're not going to be interested in them doing the diversification for you because you can do it cheaper on your own. Does that make sense? Okay. Let's talk about a proxy contest. Remember, the proxy is the way that you can give the right to vote your shares to someone else. And the way these things start is there's going to be a group of shareholders who are unhappy, and they are going to reach out to the other shareholders and say, hey, here's what we plan to do. We have this new board of directors that we would like to put in place of the current ones. And if you agree with us, give us your proxy, and we will get rid of the bums. Oh, by the way, when we get rid of the board and we put our new board in, what do you think is going to happen to the current CEO? Right? We're going to clean house, baby. So this is why we were reaching out proxy-wise to try to achieve this. Now, if this works out, it's certainly cheaper than buying the shares. If Ms. Herdman believes in what I'm doing, she's going to give me the proxy for her shares, not because she's expecting to be paid for that proxy, but because she's expecting the share price to go up after I do this. Now, I'll give you a couple of examples of proxies, one that worked and one that kind of worked, but most of them actually fail. So here's one that worked. The company behind the Olive Garden. You guys familiar with the Olive Garden? Where old people go to eat. Okay, the Olive Garden, they had a policy called N+1 on breadsticks. You guys know what N+1 is? So my wife and I used to eat there back when we were older, and they would always bring us 3 breadsticks. N was the number of people sitting at the table, and then they bring one more. And every time they do this, I'd say, what are you trying to start a fight? Right? Because I eat one, my wife eats one, and then we're both eyeballing it. It doesn't occur to us to cut it in half because that's not the kind of people we are, right? Okay, so that's the N+1 rule. Well, it got to where they were not abiding by the N+1 rule, and they were basically just everything at this place was just going to hell in a handbasket. And so a group, I think it was Starboard Capital, actually bought up a small amount of the shares, and then they launched a proxy contest to get rid of the management. It was called Darden. Get rid of the management of Darden and put their own people in. And it worked. And it worked not only from the process of them winning, but it also worked from the perspective of shareholder value started to increase, which is what we're all looking for. Okay, let me give you a second example, one that kind of worked. Back in the early 80s, a guy became CEO of Disney. His name was Michael Eisner. And of course, being a 12-year-old nerd, I'm watching Disney. And this guy comes on, and it's the first time I've actually seen the CEO of a company, CEO Michael Eisner. Hello, I'm Michael Eisner, CEO of Disney. And I looked at him, I'm like, that guy's going places, Mom. That guy's going, he's going to be big. And sure enough, he was. He did all sorts of amazing things and got all sorts of things started. Some of them were a little rocky at first, like European Disney, but then eventually things take off, and he does create a lot of value for the shareholders. But here's what happens as people get older. They get lazier. I hate to pick on you, Isabel.
I don't mind.
Oh, thank you. Okay. Are you lazier now than you were at 22 years old?
Yes.
Oh, hell yes. And I'm 51. I can tell you I'm lazier now than when I was your age, right? Okay. So we prefer, as we get older, we prefer what's called the quiet life. Do you think Michael's going to look for more places to build, like Africa Disney? No. He's like, I'm just going to sit here and kind of make this work for me. And so things kind of get stale. In the meantime, Walt Disney's nephew, Roy, is on the board. Roy, who the other people at Disney refer to as Walt's idiot nephew. No kidding. That's straight from the Journal, Wall Street Journal. Okay, Walt's idiot nephew, he actually leads a revolt to try to get rid of Michael Eisner. And the way he does that is by launching a proxy contest. And in the end, I gotta make sure this thing doesn't turn off. In the end, what happens is that 43% of the shares vote for Roy's proposed board of directors. Now, do you think 43% wins? No. But here's what happened next. A very interesting thing happened next. By the way, if you're on the board and 43% of the shares vote for anything, do you think that should get your attention? Yeah. And what we've got to keep in mind is a lot of shares don't ever get voted at all, right? Like me, I don't vote my shares. And so what ends up happening is the board of directors goes, whoa! And they start to think, we've got to protect these cushy positions that we have on the board. And so what do? They call Michael in. And they say, Michael, you've done such a great job over the years. We are eternally grateful for everything you've done. And of course, Michael's like, oh, yes. And then they say, in fact, we have enjoyed what you've done so much that we would like for you to train your successor. And so here's what we would propose. We're going to hire a new person to be CEO of Disney. And over a 2-year period, we want you to mentor this person. And as over time, you'll hand over more and more responsibilities to this person. And then at the end of 2 years, they'll become the CEO, and you will be the CEO emeritus. What does emeritus mean? Retired. It's what I hope to be someday, Professor Emeritus, right? Retired. Okay, now, oh, by the way, we're going to keep you on after that as a consultant because your knowledge is just so valuable. We'll pay you $2 million a year just to hang around and be a consultant, just when we need to talk. You don't have to come in every day. What does Michael say?
Yeah.
Yeah, and why does Michael say it? Does Michael really want to give up being in charge of Disney? No, but Michael can read the writing on the wall, right? Yeah, he saw that 43%, and now he's been called into the special meeting of the board. Oh yeah, that's great. Last time I saw Michael Eisner, he was talking to someone on one of the stupid morning shows, and they said, well, what have you been doing with your time? He's like, oh, I've been writing children's books, it's great, and he was telling how much better his life is now that he's not at Disney. If they gave him the opportunity to go back to Disney, he'd be back there in a second, right? That proxy contest, even though it wasn't successful, did it achieve the goal?
Yeah.
Yeah. By the way, Walt Disney was from Missouri, if you didn't know that. Questions? So let's talk about going private. A small group of investors, usually including the management, are out to purchase the shares of the firm. And the reason they're going to do this is to get it off the market, and now they're going to be the shareholders. They won't have to deal with individual shareholders anymore. They only have to be answering basically to themselves. And how are they going to get the money to do that? Well, they're going to use debt. Now, keep in mind that most CEOs are people like me. People who come from modest means, people who might have got a scholarship to go to college, and then basically they've worked their way up. They've done a good job on the way, and now they're making what you might consider good money. However, are they truly rich? Could they, now Elon Musk maybe, but could they go out and just buy their own company with the stock? No. And so they're going to have to go out and borrow this money. Now you might say, where are they going to borrow the money? Well, the answer is they're going to borrow the money using the assets of the target as the collateral for the loan. They don't even own the company yet, and they're going to use those assets as the collateral for the loan. And you say, that's crazy. Anybody who's ever bought a car or a house has done precisely the same thing. When I signed the mortgage on my house, did I own it? No. But it is the collateral for that loan. And when you signed on the papers for the car, did you own it? No. But it is the collateral for that loan. So it's exactly the same thing. Okay, now we call these leveraged buyouts. Leveraged because we're using debt to do it. So you may hear it called an LBO, and you may hear it called an MBO for a management buyout. But the thing is, the shares are no longer traded afterward. If you want to see a good movie about a going private transaction, the movie is called Barbarians at the Gate. Barbarians at the Gate. And I think you can watch it on YouTube for free with ads or whatever, but you can usually find it somewhere free to watch. I will warn you, there is some foul language and some brief nudity, but you should just power through that and enjoy the show. Okay, it'll teach you a lot about leveraged buyouts. Now, let's talk about how this creates value. First of all, let's say the CEO, they are going to have to pay more for the shares than they're currently trading at. Remember, they've got to offer a premium. And so that's bringing value to the current shareholders. Are you with me so far? Okay, now, here's the really fun thing. When the deal closes, they have a big party. And there's lots of champagne. And everybody has a great time. We're masters of our own destiny now. We're in charge. Yay! And the very next morning, the CEO wakes up with a headache. And it's not just because of the champagne. It's because of this huge amount of debt that they've taken on. By the way, how long does the CEO have before she has to make the coupon payment on those bonds? How often do bonds usually pay coupons? Yeah, semi-annually. So they've got 6 months to get their crap together, right? And so what do? So the CEO drags into the office about 7:30 the next morning. The assistant shows up at 7:45 and says, "Ms. Jones, I haven't seen you here this early since the 80s. And Ms. Jones says, "Well, yeah, I've got to get to work to make this thing work out. Because if we don't start cutting some costs, reorganizing the company, we're going to end up defaulting on that next coupon." And we call this the disciplining effect of debt. The disciplining effect of debt. By the way, have you ever seen the original 1930s Snow White cartoon? And so what did the seven dwarfs do for a living? They mine diamonds, actually, right? And what's the song that they sing when they're going down to the mine? Hi-ho, hi-ho, it's off to work we go, right? So here's the disciplining effect of debt. I owe, it's off to work I go. Let's do 2 words right there. I owe, it's off to work I go. Does that make sense? This morning I woke up, by the way, this story's total crap. This morning I woke up and the alarm goes off and I tell my wife, I don't want to go to work. She's like, I feel a sharp jab right here. She says, boop. She says, we got a mortgage to pay. You need to get up, go to work, because they're not going to pay you if you don't show up, right? That's the disciplining effect of debt. Does that make sense? My father-in-law, he's a crafty guy. My mother-in-law wanted a nice car, one that she couldn't afford to pay cash for. And he says, okay. Now, why do you think he did it? She had a job she was thinking about quitting. But once she has that car payment, what's she got to do? She got to keep her job, right? Does that make sense? Okay. Any questions? So let's talk about some alternatives to mergers. The first is strategic alliance. This is where we have this agreement to cooperate in pursuit of a common goal. And I'll talk about the examples on the slide here in a little bit, but I'll go ahead and tell you there's another example of this more up to date, and that is the 10-speed transmission. And I forget if it's GM, Ford, and what do they ever they call themselves these days? Dodge, those people. I forget was all three or just two of them, but they got together to develop a 10-speed transmission. Now, developing a transmission is very expensive, right? And do you ever say, oh yeah, I want that car because it's got, and then you name the strange little transmission that's in it? That's a very rare occurrence. Now, frankly, I'm a big fan of the ZF 8-speed automatic. I've got two vehicles with it from different brands. It's important to me, but I'm a nerd, right? Most people don't care. And so now, if you drive an American pickup truck with a 10-speed transmission, there's a good chance that that 10-speed transmission came from the strategic alliance between some of these different companies. Because they know there's no competitive advantage in the 10-speed, it's better to go ahead and share the development costs. Does that make sense? Okay, now let's talk about what else we've got going on here. We've got these code share agreements with airlines, between airlines. And so the year is 1998, and I get told to go home and I'm in Dallas, Texas. I told to go home and pack a bag and head to grab my passport and head to the airport because there's trouble at our plant in Scotland. And so I go out, and they say the tickets are waiting for you at the airport because back then we didn't have e-tickets, right? And so I go to the airport, sure enough, the tickets are there, and I got the last seat on the plane, which is like there's 5 across in the back row, and I'm sitting in the middle, and it doesn't recline. Yeah, okay. So fly over there, land at London Gatwick, and I'm looking for my flight, AA, and I'm looking lost. And this nice British lady in a uniform says, "Love, can I help you?" By the way, when a British lady calls you love, it doesn't mean anything other than she's just being nice, right? She says, "Love, can I help you?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm looking for AA." She's like, "Oh," she says, "that's a code share flight. What you're actually looking for is BA, British Airways flight. I'm like, ah, first I'd ever heard of this, right? Now, let's ask the question, why would American Airlines and British Airlines work together, British Airways? Why would they work this way together? And the answer is that they both fly, they compete flying from the UK to the US, but do you think BA wants to build out a route network in the United States? No. That's too expensive, and it's really outside their core competency. Do you think American Airlines wants to build out a route network in the UK? No. And so these people can get together, even though they're still fiercely competing on that transatlantic segment, they can get together to try to hand off customers to each other. Does that make sense? Now, what else goes along with this? The frequent flyer miles typically go back and forth. That's a big dirty lie. Anytime I've tried to transfer airline miles from one to another, I've never gotten anywhere. So be careful with that one. Now, that's what the strategic, that's in the favorite example we have of these strategic alliances. Any questions? By the way, do you think strategic alliances typically have any factories or office buildings? No, it's typically just two companies working together. They're probably hooked together by a computer system. In the case of the 10-speed transmission, both companies probably sent some of their engineers to maybe another place. They rented out an office to work on this transmission. Okay, now let's talk about joint ventures, which are also called JVs. This is where two companies put up money and or other assets to establish a new firm. Let's talk about an example from the bigger world, and then we'll talk about an example that I was familiar with. Back in the early 80s, GM was making really bad cars that got really bad gas mileage. Toyota was making really good cars that got really good gas mileage. Toyota, though, has a problem. Ronald Reagan is president, and one of the things that Ronald Reagan has done has kind of put some tariffs in place for Japanese cars that are not made in the U.S. And so now Japanese manufacturers have to start building factories in the United States. Toyota has no expertise in dealing with American suppliers or American labor unions. They have no expertise in any of this, but who does? General Motors. General Motors has no expertise in building good cars to get good gas mileage, but who does? Toyota. And so what do? They go together in this joint venture. And GM, being scumbags like all humans, do you think they put their best plant into the joint venture? No, they put their absolute worst plant in the world. It's in Fremont, California. They put the absolute worst plant up. Let me tell you about this plant at Fremont, California. The workers, if you got a car out of this plant, you wanted one made in the morning because the workers would go out and smoke marijuana on their lunch break and come back in, and then the cars in the afternoon had a lot more defects. You could probably figure out why. Man, these knobs are huge, right? That sort of stuff. Oh, no, that's LSD. Back to the story. Back to the story. So this is really a big old mess. And so Toyota comes in, and Toyota says, well, wait a minute, I think we could solve this problem. And what they did is they made lunch at the company cafeteria free as long as the employees stayed on premises. And so it turns out that, stoners have munchies. If you'll just give them free food, maybe they'll stick around and not be high for the second half of their shift. Isn't that ingenious? And so Toyota jumps in there, and they also submit the car that's supposed to be built there. It's a Toyota Corolla, basically, is being built there along with the Geo something or other, which was GM's version of the same car. Now, in the meantime, Toyota learns about American suppliers, American unions. GM learns how to make a car that doesn't suck, and the plant does pretty well. Fast forward to GM's bankruptcy. Every one of these GV agreements should have it in somewhere that if there's a bankruptcy, they can get out. And so Toyota took the opportunity. By the time GM goes bankrupt in 2008, I think, Toyota already knows how to build cars. In fact, they're building cars all over the United States by that time. So do they need that plant anymore? No. And so they take that opportunity to walk away. GM goes bankrupt. The building for that factory gets sold in bankruptcy. Who buys it? Say again?
Toyota.
No. Tesla. If you've got a Tesla out of the Fremont, California plant, it's made in that same building where the workers used to. Yeah. Which, by the way, kind of fits with Elon, right? Does that make sense? Okay. That's a joint venture. Now I'm going to tell you about one that I have personal experience with. At the end, the Berlin Wall fell my first year of college, and then Russia just basically gives up and pulls back the Red Army from all of Europe. And so there are all these old trucks in Russia. And hopefully by now you're aware that Russia makes a lot of petroleum, right? A lot of oil in Russia. But under the Soviet system, they did not invest in the wells like they should. And so the wells were just producing at a trickle. And so they know they've got to invest in them. They don't have a lot of money. So what do? There's a guy in Russia that buys up a bunch of these old Red Army trucks, and he reaches out to my employer, Halliburton. Halliburton has a bunch of old oil field stimulation equipment that we had left over from the last boom. And so we would basically rebuild these pumps and send them over there. Now this guy also had a building, and in that building we would mount our equipment onto his trucks, and then we would sell them to these new companies that are out there stimulating these wells to get them to produce oil again. Now and at the end of it, when the trucks were all gone and the pumps were all gone, we basically just parted the assets and parted ways. That's how a joint venture works. Let me tell you a little bit of a cultural story here, though. My buddy Andy was in charge of putting this all together, and when he came back from Russia, he looked really, really bad. And I said, "What's up?" And he said, "Well, first of all, when you go over there, take a suitcase full of canned food," because at that time, food wasn't like really high on their agenda. And he also said, there were some other things he said, but here was the big one. He says, "Do you know how they seal a deal in Russia?" And I said, "No." He says, "First you go out and you get really drunk." What do you think they're drinking?
Vodka.
Vodka, very good. Okay, you get really drunk, and then you strip off naked, and you sit in the sauna together. Okay. He says, and then they've got these willow branches, and you beat each other with the willow branches inside the sauna. Have you guys ever heard of the beating with the willow branches inside a sauna? This is a very northern European, Scandinavian thing to do. Beat each other with willow branches. And then, when you're all good and hot, drunk, and beat up, you go out and all together you take a plunge into a frozen river or pond. I usually have at least one person in the class who has been to Russia or is from Russia, and they can testify that this story is true. Unfortunately, I don't think we have any today. But yeah, so if you don't want to get naked with strangers, don't go to Russia. There's your moral to the story. That's your cultural lesson for the day. Questions? Okay. Now let's talk about taxable acquisitions. So, if I sell my shares in the target firm, if I sell them to you, and of course, hopefully, I'm going to get more out of the shares than I paid for them, I'm going to have a capital gain. And that will be a capital, that means I'll have to pay capital gains tax. So, the taxability of an acquisition has to do with the taxability to the target shareholders. And so we're talking about whether or not they're going to have to pay capital gains tax or not. If we do a cash acquisition, it's taxable. However, if instead we offer them shares in the new firm, then it's considered that they just had a transfer of their equity interest from one firm to another, and it's not considered a taxable event. And so if you were a shareholder and you didn't want to have to pay capital gains taxes, like my dad, you would be thrilled to get stock instead of cash. However, we're going to talk about why stock might not be the best thing that you would hope for in an acquisition. Any questions? Okay. So, in a tax-free acquisition, it's considered an exchange instead of a sale, and so it's going to be a stock offer, but they still have some requirements for it to be tax-free. You know the government's going to look at everything to make sure that you're paying your fair share of the taxes. And the requirements are, number one, that it must be for business purposes, not just to avoid paying taxes, and I'll tell you how to avoid paying taxes using a merger. So that's the number one. And number two, it just has to be this continuation of equity interest. In other words, you were an equity holder in this one, and now you're an equity holder in the new firm. That's all you got to do. So what do? When we're making the announcement for the merger, we don't say, oh yeah, we're doing this to save on our taxes. We talk about synergies, which you guys remember synergy from chapter 8, and we'll talk about it more here. We talk about economies of scale. We talk about all sorts of stuff. And then we say in our very fine print voice, oh, and by the way, there will be a tax savings. Right? That way, your acquisition isn't seen as being primarily for tax avoidance purposes. Questions? Okay, so your book mentions a couple, and one of them is the pooling of interests. And in fact, the merger that I lived through was a pooling of interest merger, where basically you just add the balance sheets together from both firms, right? You just add them together. By the way, you're adding together book values, you're not dealing with market values, there's all sorts of fuzziness there. But if we do what's called the purchase accounting, and by the way, pooling of interest is now illegal, so don't even worry about it too much. If we do the purchase accounting method, what we do is we report the assets of the target on our books as their fair market value. Even though they might have only been on the books of the other firm at $10,000, if the fair market value of those assets are $100,000, then I would put them on my books as $100,000. So that's the first thing we do, is record their assets at fair market value. Now, if we ended up paying more for the company than just the sum of the fair market value of all the assets, which undoubtedly we will, because the value of the firm isn't just the assets, it's things like reputation and customer base and things like that. So we're going to end up paying more than that. Anything we pay over and above gets put into an account called goodwill. Goodwill is an intangible asset. And we used to require companies to basically amortize or expense out that goodwill over a period, let's say 10 years. So every year they'd have to write down 10%. But then the companies made a good argument. They said, wait a minute, what if the goodwill isn't diminished? Then why should we have to keep writing it down? And the Financial Accounting Standards Board said, yeah, that's actually correct. Why don't we instead every year check our goodwill for impairment? Check our goodwill for there we go. Check our goodwill for impairment. And so every year we go out and we look and see if our purchase has had its value go down because of something that's diminished the goodwill of the company. So let's say that, do you guys remember Tiger Woods? Okay. What happened to Tiger Woods? I think it was Thanksgiving or Christmas or something like that. He got in a car wreck. Was it just like, well, this is his first car wreck that I'm talking about, when he wrecks the Escalade into a fire plug. I'm sorry, I need to update my stories here.
Suppose a tree.
Was it a tree?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. He hits a tree, and what had led to the whole chase?
Oh, I don't know. I thought he was just high on pills and went out and went before. But
He was having an affair.
He was having an affair. He was having an affair. He takes off, and it's not very far from the house. He hits a tree, fire plug, something. He's trapped in the Escalade, and his wife rescues the living fire out of him with a 9-iron, right? Now, when the story gets out, by the way, up to that point, Tiger Woods had a fairly squeaky clean reputation. And he's making all sorts of good money on these, what are they called? Sponsorships, right? Now, so Nike had very heavily invested in Tiger Woods. Do you think Nike needed to write down the value of its goodwill? Let's assume Tiger's a company and they bought him and had goodwill. Would they have to write down that goodwill? Oh yeah, the goodwill would be highly diminished. Does that make sense? Okay, so not something hopefully you guys will have to worry about, but something that corporations do. Okay, that's all we're going to say about accounting, because this is not an accounting class. If we're going to do this stuff, there has to be a gain. By the way, what's the goal of financial management?
Increase shareholder wealth.
Maximize shareholder wealth, right? Maximize shareholder wealth. So I, as a bidding manager, when I go out to make these acquisitions, I need to look at them just like I'm doing a capital budgeting project. And we said with capital budgeting project, if NPV is negative, what do? Yeah, we reject it. If NPV is negative on the acquisition, we need to reject it. Okay, and so the question is, where are these gains going to come from? Because after all, we just got through saying that the company is fairly priced by the stock market as a standalone company. And so there has to be something that putting these two firms together is going to give us. And that's where we get these gains to our acquisition. So those benefits are going to fall into these four categories. We're going to go over all of these in detail, but it's either a revenue enhancement, more money coming in the door, cost reduction, less money going out the door, tax reduction, less taxes going out the door, or a reduction in capital needs, meaning that the two companies together won't need as many assets as the two companies as standalone. So let's give some examples. First of all, marketing gains. And you see this one a lot. Our advertising department is so much better than your advertising department. By putting us together, we're going to have gains in that. We're going to take the money you were spending on ads, we're going to cut that by half, and we'll still get more money and more benefit out of it than your current situation. Then, and to me, that's kind of questionable. But the one that does make a lot of sense is distribution. Let's give an example. There's a company called Kraft. What is Kraft? What is their big product? Mac and cheese, that's what's made here in Springfield. So let's say overall they are a cheese company. That's one of their big things is cheese. You go to the grocery store, you'll see Kraft cheese on the shelf. Okay, now assume that there is a small artisanal goat cheese maker here in Springfield. They have their own goat herd. They've got about 300 goats. And they're making all this cheese. And they can't manage to sell all of it because there just aren't that many people in Springfield that are interested in goat cheese. People from the Middle East like it. Hippies like it. And my wife and I like it. But as far as I know, those are like the big core audiences, right? Do we have a lot of people from the Middle East in Springfield? No. We do have hippies, but they probably don't have the kind of money they need for goat cheese. So we're talking about a pretty small audience here in Springfield. But the man's got 300 goats. He has to sell his goat cheese fairly cheap just to get rid of it, right? Now, what if Kraft were to buy out the goat cheese operation? What does Kraft have that this little goat farmer doesn't have? Worldwide distribution, right? And by the way, there is a large population of Middle Eastern folks in Detroit and around in Michigan altogether. Kraft can take this extra goat cheese from Springfield and send it up to Michigan, bless you, and sell it at a premium to what the goat farmer was able to make here in Springfield. So that would be a marketing gain from distribution. And then we have strategic benefits. It gives you an option for expansion. So let's talk about Procter & Gamble. Procter & Gamble back in the 1950s, they are in the soap business. And in fact, they were the original sponsors of those daytime television dramas, which is how they became known as soap operas, because all the ads were for soap. Very good. Okay. Now, as they move along, though, they decide they want to get into some other areas. And so they could, and they've got a huge R&D operation, they could have just decided, figured out how to make toilet paper, but it turns out that that's actually pretty difficult. By the way, the original patent for toilet paper, do you know what the big selling point of the paper they were making was? No splinters. Yeah. I'll give you a moment to think about splinters in your toilet paper and you'll realize why that's a big, big problem. Well, it turns out it's really not that easy to do. So what does Procter & Gamble go out and do? They go out and they buy Charmin. But did they just buy Charmin for Charmin? No. They bought Charmin because they knew if they could figure out how to make toilet paper, they could also do paper towels. Do you think it's as hard to make paper towels as it is to make toilet paper? No. First of all, people aren't nearly as upset about splinters in their paper towels. And they're basically the same product, right? It's paper on a roll. So it gives them the opportunity to jump into paper towels. And they did, and the paper towel was called Bounty. And so that is the first product that comes about as a result of that. And then, of course, along the way, they get a lot of experience with human waste. And they're like, well, wait a minute, we know human waste. We know absorbent paper stuff. We can start doing diapers. And so in 1967, Pampers come out. I was the last of my cousins to be brought up in cloth diapers. Everybody after me was in those disposable things, right? But buying Charmin gave them the options to move into these other areas. Does that make sense? Okay, when we get together next time, we're going to start by talking about market power. Are there any questions? Okay, see you next time.